The views and opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect those of Access Fort Wayne, the Allen County Public Library, or any other supporting groups. If you'd like to produce a show, call us at 260-421-1250.
Let me be your lighthouse so I can show you the way. Let me be your shining light, I'll keep you from drifting away. I'm the one that makes you try when...
This is Patty Hunter of Patty's Page. Welcome to my show. On the phone is Nancy Valko. She's with Nurses for Life, and we were talking last week about assisted suicide and euthanasia and all that. Let's continue what we were talking about. Do you remember what we were saying?
We were talking about assisted suicide being passed in the States.
Yeah.
And Oregon was the first, and they implemented it in 1999. And as I think I mentioned before, suicide rates in the United States, regular suicide, I hate to call it regular, were declining rapidly until the end of the 90s. And all of a sudden they started skyrocketing. Just around the time Oregon started implementing their first law. And there was a study done back in 2015, and they actually found that assisted suicide, when people, states passed assisted suicide laws, the regular suicide rate went up. And in Oregon, I saw that within a few years, they were talking about having this horrible suicide rate in Oregon. And they were, at one point, 42% above the national average for suicide.
That is an epidemic right there, kid.
Yeah. You've got, it was just so obvious there. And now we have so many people killing themselves a day. It's really bad. And this is the problem. Now, the assisted suicide people, and this is interesting. After my daughter died, I had been talking to suicide prevention organizations. And I go, what's your position? And they all said, oh, we don't touch that. We're about suicide. And they go, that's a different thing. Well, it's also politically incorrect.
Right.
But I said, but these people want to commit suicide. I've talked to terminally ill people who are considering suicide and talked them out of it, by doing really good care, listening to them and finding out what their needs were, which is what palliative care is. And they said, well, and they've got a book out, one of the people who's involved with these suicide prevention groups, who has a book out called The Rational Suicide. And they've got a lot of ethicists that say, yeah, suicide is one thing, but assisted suicide with these terminally ill people, that's different. They're making a rational decision. However, and what people don't know is that even with these assisted suicide bills, unlike anybody else, and I'm a nurse, I take care of a lot of suicidal people, when someone is talking about suicide, you have intensive management. You get involved. You find out what's going on.
Yeah.
Unlike that, we always get a mental health workup.
Yes.
And because about 90% of them are due to depression.
Yes.
But in this, they said only if the doctors think there might be a problem with the person's competency to make a decision can they ask for a mental health exam. And that's why there's almost no mental health exams done in any state with an assisted suicide law.
Well, that's not right.
Go ahead.
That is just pure evil. They don't care about the human...
It is, and that's one of the things I found when I talk to legislators and lawyers and stuff like that. A lot of people think that legislators are all just, they all have law degrees and they have research staff, and they don't. That was an interesting thing. And they don't know what this law really says, and now they're trying to expand it. A recent Delaware bill tried to expand it to include, redefine assisted suicide as palliative care. They've tried to expand it to allow nurses to do it for physician's assistants. in Canada, I think this is probably one of the worst. The Canadian nurses, when we nurses were against the American Nurses Association draft position, they wrote something and they said, don't do it. We started our group when Canada legalized assisted suicide in 2015. And they found there were no conscience rights. There was all this pressure to go even in faith-based communities. And what's really interesting, they started out, the Canadian Supreme Court said, well, okay, we'll legalize euthanasia and you all work out the details. Well, instead, it just kind of took off. And in the second largest province in Canada, some doctors had talked to the doctors in Holland where the assisted suicide, euthanasia, was really high there. It's the biggest country with it.
Yes.
And they said, oh, we don't use pills. We use lethal injections. So these doctors then decided in the second largest province in Canada.
Is this Ontario?
I think that's Quebec.
Quebec? Ah.
Yeah. And they made up enough assisted suicide lethal injection kits for every doctor of every specialty, no matter what their experience, in that province, ready to go. And now 99% of assisted suicides are lethal injections, not self-ingestion.
I'm from Canada.
Canada is really different, and the nurses up there said, please, please fight this. It's just so bad up here.
Yes.
It's really terrible. But even your basic assisted suicide law, they all kind of base themselves on Oregon, and then some of them are trying different things. One thing that's interesting is when we fight it, we have gotten it defeated in more states than it has passed. And the ones where it has passed, it's been multiple efforts to get it passed. That's really bad. But with these bills, I said even with your basic one, people see all these wonderful Gallup poll questions. And the latest one said, when a person has a disease that cannot be cured and is living in severe pain, do you think doctors should or should not be allowed by law to assist the patient to commit suicide if the patient requests it? Oh, and 62% said yes.
Oh my goodness.
Well, that's not actually what they say in those laws. Pain or other suffering is not a requirement for a person seeking assisted suicide. And a disease that cannot be cured can also include manageable conditions like diabetes, as well as terminal illnesses like cancer,
Oh my.
which is interesting. And in Oregon, a Swedish researcher was investigating it, and he was reading the Oregon law, and he goes, oh, it doesn't have pain, and this terminal illness thing, expected to die in 6 months, that's kind of broad. So he called Oregon and talked to one of the people who worked there and said, terminal illness expected to die in 6 months. What if an insurance company refused a treatment that would help a person live longer? Would that be considered terminal to get assisted suicide? And the guy said yes.
Oh my God.
He said, well, what if it's something like diabetes, where someone doesn't take their insulin and could die within 6 months? Would that be considered terminal under Oregon's laws? They said yes. So and pain and suffering's not in there. Terminal is a really loose term. Some of the states have tried things like death in the foreseeable future. Well, all of us are going to die someday. And one of the most egregious things that a lot of the legislators who don't really read these bills carefully, it gives complete immunity to the doctors participating in physician-assisted suicide.
Open season.
You're immune from civil malpractice or any kind of law. It cannot be prosecuted. And all it requires is the doctor to self-report. He makes out if the doctor decides to accept it, he has a very simple little couple pages, and he has to call in a consulting doctor who will agree that the diagnosis is terminal. And then once that happens, they have the patient sign it and check to see if the person's competent, which is really interesting. Up in Oregon, they had a letter to the editor in the Oregon papers while this was going on, and this woman's mother had Alzheimer's. Now, my mother had Alzheimer's and terminal cancer, but her mother had Alzheimer's, and she was kind of in the mild to moderate stage. And so she went with her to ask their doctor, she wants assisted suicide. And the doctor says, no, I don't think so. So she went to another doctor and another doctor. And she said, I'm having trouble finding a doctor who will do what my mother wants. She was taking this gal around. Finally, they found the head of a HMO, health maintenance organization, who finally said, okay, you can do it. I'll allow it. It's really loose, and it requires nothing but self-reporting, complications or anything like that. It's all self-reporting. And one of the things that really shocked a lot of legislators when I told them, the cause of death must be falsified.
What?
Because they say they're protecting privacy, all the papers, with this stuff, you must put down the cause of death, not the overdose, but rather their underlying condition. So that, and this is really important because, like the coroner's medical handbook said, it's really important to get the cause of death right because that affects prognoses and statistics and funding and stuff like that. And up in Connecticut recently, where they had a bill, thankfully defeated, their criminal justice division came out and said, we're not saying anything about the law, but you can't falsify death certificates.
That's right.
And they think that's very important. It's crazy.
That would be lying.
And the doctor's not required to be there or anything. All he does is write a prescription. And they have found, and they'll even admit it, 1/3 of all those prescriptions given to a person to take, 1/3 of them don't take it, but there's no follow-up.
Right.
They don't want to put the names down. They destroy the records in a year. No one follows up. Was the diagnosis wrong? Did the patient die of natural causes? Did the patient change its mind? Nobody cares.
Just like abortion here.
And in California, when California legalized assisted suicide recently, UCLA, a big university there, decided to try a project. So they took people who were eligible for assisted suicide. Instead of just using a doctor, they talked to them. They had social workers and mental health specialists talk to them, and they found out that most of what people were worried about was dying and leaving the family and sorrow and things like that. When they got through, after that, only 25% went on to commit assisted suicide,
So,
which was huge. And I said, this is what I've done. People say, how do you talk people out of suicide? I had a man ask me about that, and I said, I listen.
good.
And it's really interesting. I find out what's it about, what are they talking about, and these people, with the exception of my daughter, all rejected suicide, which was really interesting. But the secrecy and the immunity that surrounds everything about it makes it right for like elder abuse. These people go home, and I did one of my most recent blogs was assisted suicide and failure of unconsciousness.
Yes.
People think they just take a pill, they go to sleep, and then they die.
Oh.
And they don't have to tell their families. Some do, some don't. Some have had parties. But what happened is an international group of neurologists and anesthesiologists, they said, we've had unexpected awakenings during surgery. How is this working? So they looked at the lethal injection capital punishment protocol. And they were stunned to find out people woke up, people had problems. They looked into all these other things. And I have to say, I was really glad. I've been looking for someone to do a study like this. And these guys were actually not against assisted suicide because I've taken care of many people who were soon to be unconscious or comatose who later on could relate things that happened while they were unconscious.
Because they can hear.
I saw it.
Right.
You know, and I used to always talk to my unconscious or comatose patients, and I was teased by a lot of people, especially my fellow nurses. They said, you talk to your refrigerator, and I said, well, sometimes, but it doesn't listen. And I said, but listen, if hearing is truly the last thing to go, which we don't know, then why not treat them like they're totally awake instead of just rolling them over where they might think they're falling out of bed, saying, I'm rolling you over, I'm going to wash your back. I said, it's a real respect for a person. And they all laughed at me until one day, and this was in like 1971, before the word vegetative state was invented. We had a 17-year-old young man came in, and he was one of the worst I've ever seen. And huge head injury. His head was swollen 3 times normal size, broken everywhere, on a ventilator. He was just a wreck, terrible blood pressure. And the brain surgeon came in and he said, well, he said, I think probably he should be a do not resuscitate because he's not even going to live till morning, which is lucky because otherwise he'd be a vegetable. And I was shocked that he said that in front of the patient. We just never did stuff like that. So anyway, I worked
They have
with
no
this
feelings,
patient.
these
Those days you
doctors.
could keep them in ICU longer. And he didn't die.
Mm.
And slowly, I got him to do lift a finger on command. And I would tell the doctor, and the doctor would come in and he'd do a pain, pinch him or something to see if he'd respond to pain,
Yeah.
which is more than just asking them to do something. And the young man, I'll call Mike, never responded. So the doctor thought I was crazy, even after the other nurses say, we saw it. Well, finally, we got him off the ventilator. He was breathing on his own. And I got him to say hi. So I called the doctor, and I said, Mike, say hi to the doctor, and he refused. And the doctor did the pain stimulation and no response. So he said, I'm beginning to wonder about your brain function. And I talked to Mike, and I said, please, Mike, the doctor thinks I'm crazy. Please do it for me. So the doctor came back in, and Mike said hi. And the doctor almost dropped. He goes, it's a miracle. I said, no, we've been working with him. So anyway, he was immediately sent off to a nursing home where we thought, nobody would be doing things. I was really sad about it. But a year and a half, 2 years later, this handsome young man comes walking into our ICU, and he says, remember me? He said, no. He said, I'm Mike. I just drove here 60 miles. I'm getting married, and I want to thank you for saving my life. And we all started crying. We said, oh, this is just wonderful. Nobody ever comes back and tells us, we have to go find them. And then laughing, I told him, I said, Mike, you're not going to remember this, but you used to respond to me, but not to the doctor. And he got real serious. He stopped laughing. He goes, oh, no. I heard him call me a vegetable.
Oh.
I wouldn't move for him.
Mm.
After that, every nurse in the unit was told, and every doctor, you treat these people like they are totally awake. And all of a sudden, we started having people recovering.
With more respect.
Sometimes all the way.
Yes.
So when they talk about, oh yeah, they, we'll just take a pill or something and go to sleep, I really doubted that. And there's real problems with this oral ingestion. People think it's just a pill. It isn't. Right now, the standard protocol they've been using involves 100 pills that have to be emptied out, put into a sweet solution, and drunk by the patient.
Oh.
And many times they can't get it down. They vomit. They had one person last for 101 days.
Wow.
And this is what they said. They said, there's a chance people are suffering terribly. How do we prove unconsciousness? So these anesthesiologists and neurologists looked at the recent research on unexpected awakening during surgery, where people sometimes didn't move. They didn't respond to anything. And they started trying to see how that would work, since obviously this stuff isn't working. And what's funny about it is they found out that there really wasn't any good way to do this. And they said no matter what they did with either self-suffocation, the lethal overdoses where death resolved slowly from asphyxia, from heart and breathing to depression,
Wow.
which you may not see, and the Dutch lethal injection. They said that there seems to be a relatively high incidence in all these things of vomiting, up to 10%, prolongation of death, up to 7 days, and reawakening from coma, up to 4%, which constitutes failure of unconsciousness. And what do you do at home? There's no doctor there. Your relative takes this stuff and maybe starts vomiting, which they could inhale. What do you do then? Put a pillow over their head? I mean, this is just horrible. And it was interesting. They also mentioned that in 2008, 2 prisoners who were on death row petitioned the U.S. Supreme Court to consider a requirement for physicians to confirm unconsciousness, because people screaming and waking up and everything when other lethal capital punishment drugs are given. They argued that they might be awake but paralyzed at the point of death, unable to say anything, and that's a cruel and inhumane punishment. They said the situation clearly parallels with the problem of the accidental awareness during general anesthesia, and it's a potent cause of distress. However, the U.S. Supreme Court rejected this argument in 2008, concluding that the anesthetic doses used reliably achieved unconsciousness without any need to check. And the authors go, we now know the court was wrong because they found out so much more. So what they came up with, they said, well, the incidence of failure of unconsciousness is approximately 190 times higher when it is intended that the patient is unconscious at the time of death, as when it is intended they later awaken and recover after surgery. So they looked at it, and they looked at all the different things, and they said, well, okay, the optimum method for doing this, and it was very interesting, is they said it would be high doses of drugs injected, brainwave tests taken at the whole time, with a sensitivity down very low so it could pick up anything.
Right.
And then clinical confirmation of unconsciousness by lack of response to command or painful arousing stimuli, such as the isolated forearm technique, where one limb in a patient who's in surgery is kind of has a tourniquet or something on it, so they're not getting the drugs, and they will move even if they're not unconscious. They will have that. But the author said that it's practically impossible with this, since the technical requirements would include the involvement of trained practitioners like anesthetist. But they said, well, society or individuals might prefer to just do the self-ingestion, even if those aren't good and carry a greater risk of consciousness at the point of death.
Yeah.
But he said, if they do, then legal frameworks and consent processes should explicitly acknowledge this choice. And they don't.
That's not right.
And that's a real problem. But this is the kind of stuff that we're dealing with, and it's not all that comfortable.
It's
when
not
people
right.
Die.
Not humane.
Pardon me?
Not humane.
No, it's really not humane, and people think it is. And when things happen, but it doesn't have to be reported. And I know Compassion Choices says, oh, it's wonderful, and it's so good for the family. What if you're a family member, and they can't get it down, or they get it all down, but they don't die and don't die? I saw a record at one point of 104 hours, and where they kept going. Now, what do you do then? Then you have to, it's interesting, in Holland, where they got away from the self-ingestion, they said people who want to take a lethal overdose, if they don't die within 2 hours, then they get a lethal injection. They have guidelines on all of this. That's how they found out so much. The Dutch may be not the most ethical people in the world, but they do incredible record keeping. And that's a lot from Britain. But even these doctors who were for it were not thrilled. You know, they said, this isn't really working. So we have real problems with this. And the whole point is we should be helping people, not killing them.
Yeah.
And that's what we did in the beginning. And that's why I was so thrilled to work with terminal cancer patients and in hospice. And I loved hospice. It was just wonderful.
Yes.
And at one point, I was offered the directorship of a hospice because of my work with them. But I turned it down because I saw where things were going. This was in about 1994.
Yeah.
And because our hospice and palliative care journal for nurses actually had an editorial, an op-ed, that talked about needing to get away from the traditional hospice requirement that death is neither hastened nor prolonged to autonomy, the patient's choice. And this is where the bioethics comes in. We now talk about bioethics instead of ethics. And bioethics is kind of interesting because it does not take the traditional ones. What it tried to do is take the Hippocratic Oath, which they think is old-fashioned, particularly now that abortion is widely done, and now we have assisted suicide. So they want to get away from it. So they came up with principles like non-malfeasance. You know, you don't want to cause harm. Autonomy is the largest one, the patient's choice. But interestingly, as with my daughter, and I gave a lecture at the Scholl Institute of Bioethics a couple of years ago on this, when all of this right to die came through, the living wills and the Nancy Cruzan case and the Terry Schiavo case, and all these cases were, you know, the wrong way. When all this was happening, the right to die Compassion Choices people thought, oh, this is good. We have people sign living wills. We just make sure that they have living wills. Well, the problem is doctors wanted to take her off the ventilator,
Yeah.
but the husband refused. And they were surprised, and they talked to him and talked to him, and he goes, nope, she doesn't want that. And she was unconscious, so they went to court, and the judge found in favor of the husband.
Yeah.
They go, well, that's just wrong.
Uh-oh.
And so they came up with this idea of medical futility, where if something is, that if the doctors disagree or an ethics committee disagrees, they can overrule the patient. And there's actually a law in Texas that some other states have tried, where if the doctors or the ethics committee decide that the treatment is futile and burdensome and better for the patient, they can give the family 2 weeks to find another place, or they just remove the treatment. Now, I was involved with exactly that case with no law a number of years ago when I was, people knew I worked a lot with the so-called vegetative and woke them up, and
Yeah.
so they called me in, and I worked with people, and except for one person, people made really sometimes complete recoveries. Everybody improved except one man. He did not get much better. But I was called in to see this man who was 62 and had been hit by a truck, literally, and bad head injury and on a ventilator, and he was down at the hospital, and the family asked me to come in. And so I said, well, this is what I do with people, trying to stimulate them like I did with Mike. And later on, Jane Hoyt wrote a pamphlet on it with different things, how to help stimulate someone presumed to be unconscious or semi-conscious,
Yeah.
and had great results with that up in Minnesota. And I worked with this man, and I gave the people this pamphlet, and we worked with them. And they said, the doctors say there's no way he can ever get off the ventilator. So after
They
a few
decided
days,
that, right?
He was moved. They got him to move, but the doctor said it was just reflex. And then they said, we really think he should be off the ventilator. And the family said, no, we want rehab and all. And they gave them 2 weeks to find another place. So I helped them. We found another place and took him there. And they were going, why would we have this guy? And it was really weird, but we kept working with him. And eventually, and this was funny, 2.5 months after his accident,
Right.
he was awake and doing things on command. He wound up making a virtually complete recovery. And I was called because the family somehow or another let someone in the UK know about it, and a documentary crew came over to film this and talk to the family, and they wanted me to be there to show how well he had recuperated and how this is so terrible that we're giving up on these people. So that was kind of interesting. But I actually saw that happen here, and now in Missouri, we think this will be the 5th year, we're trying to get a Simon's Law passed. And I was called in on this by the mother of a little boy who was born with trisomy 18, which is a life-limiting disease. It's not Down syndrome. A lot of times they don't live very long.
Yeah.
But now we find out they can live for years. But he needed heart surgery, which they wanted to have. And he was in the hospital. And all of a sudden his breathing went down and everything. And they go, are you going to do something? And nobody did anything. And one of the nurses says, why don't you try breastfeeding him? And she didn't understand what was going on. And she said, well, call the doctor. The little boy died in their arms. And they were just shattered. They found out later that hospital had, and it was a Catholic hospital, a medical futility policy. That the doctors, if they believed it was futile or burdensome, they could just deny treatment, but they didn't even tell the family.
They should have.
And these people could have sued, but instead they decided to go for a law so this wouldn't happen to anyone else.
Yeah.
And it went in the Missouri legislature. I testified, and the doctors were against it. The pediatrician said, well, families don't always know best, and that stuff. It looks like this year we may be able to get it through Missouri, but it was passed in Nebraska and Kansas.
Right.
Where families have to be notified ahead of time. But this is what happens. This is how choice becomes no choice. And people say, well, I've been real clear with my family and that stuff. And this is how it actually works. And many times I've had families lied to that their loved one was brain dead when they weren't. And that was to get them to remove treatment. And now there's an even greater incentive because we have something called non-heart-beating organ donation, or donation after cardiac death. Everybody's familiar with organ donation when someone's been declared brain dead, which I've written on that too. There's some problems with that. But then they came up with an idea that if they think someone is going to die or is irreparably brain injured and still on the ventilator, they can talk to the families about donating the organs. And the way they can do it is, with the family's permission, they take them to the operating room, take them off the ventilator, and wait for their heart and breathing to stop.
Mm.
If it does, they wait up 2 to 5 minutes and then start taking the organs.
Mm.
Well, this is kind of a problem.
Yeah.
And there's just a lot of problems with it. And they said that if these people don't die within like 30, 45 minutes, well, now they're going to have worse brain damage. Then they don't use the organs. They figure the organs haven't had oxygen for a while. So they put a person in a room and let them die. And up to 20% of these people don't die within the prescribed limit. And the 2 to 5 minutes is a problem. One of the guys who developed it is Dr. DeVito, and I've written about, he actually wrote on it. He says, well, he says, actually, it would have to take longer to be sure that they were brain dead, but that's not what they're looking at. They're not looking at brain death at all.
No.
And he said, yeah, he says, it may be kind of short, but he says 2 minutes, I think, is what the public would accept. So this is the kind of stuff that happens. I hate to be giving so much bad news, but Roe versus Wade really caused, I believe, this corruption in medical ethics. All of a sudden, when death was not a bad thing or something that we avoided. And like I said, people can have good deaths. I've had people with all sorts of stuff. I've taken care of a terminally ill woman who was in a van down by the river. They couldn't reach her doctor, and he said, I don't know what to do. So I went out there, came up with some things. She died very comfortably. And we reviewed all of her photographs from her life, and she went through her life, and she was fine. When she died, it was very peaceful, and they were very, the husband was very happy with it. This can be done. It can be time-consuming, but people don't.
They don't.
They just assume, and they go, well, I don't think I'd want to live like that. And they have to understand, I've worked with a lot of people with some severe disabilities, and they get so mad. They go, we're the first on the list to go next with assisted suicide. They said, we have trouble getting treated, and I've seen that. I was called in one time, a gal who was disabled. They couldn't get hold of the family, and she had stopped breathing in a nursing home, and they brought her in, and they were pumping on her, and they said, well, I think we should not even do this. And I felt, and I said, she has a pulse. And they go, wait, what? And they were mad at me.
They were mad at you?
We brought her back to the ICU, and she eventually did die. But their immediate thought was, why are we even doing cardiopulmonary resuscitation on people? And the disability people are very worried. But like they said, they have quality of life. People think that you have to be healthy to have a good quality of life. I know many people with severe disabilities who are very happy and travel all over the country to testify against these assisted suicide bills. So I think we have to change our attitudes, and I think when we get real comfortable, we go, I just want a nice, easy life, and they don't turn to religion or anything else.
They forgot about God.
It's really bad, and I found out how bad it could be. One time I was working oncology, and the doctor called and said, I've got a man, he's terminally ill with cancer, and his wife says he's in unbearable pain, so start some pain medicine. He gave me orders for when the guy came in. So when he came in, I went in expecting to see somebody writhing in pain, and I said, how are you? He said, fine. I said, do you have any pain? He goes, nope. And I go, what is this? So I took the wife aside, and I said, is there something going on here? And she started to cry. She said, he's terminally ill. I said, yes, I know. And she said, he was cleaning his gun today and looked at me and said, could you stay in this house if anything happened? And she said, I immediately knew he was talking about shooting himself. And I said, so what did you say? She said, I told him, honey, and she said, I know this is the right thing to say, honey, I support any decision you make. And then she panicked and called the doctor and said, he's in unbearable pain. Can I bring him to the hospital? And I talked to her, and I said, did you ever consider that maybe the question he was asking was something different? Like, will these last few weeks or months be too much for you or me? She said, oh, my God, I never thought of it. I said, well, how do you feel about that? She said, oh, I'd love to take care of him until he dies. We've been together decades. And I said, you two need to have a talk. and a few hours later, the doctor discharged him, and they went home smiling hand in hand, and he died very comfortably 3 weeks later at home.
See, that's what bugs me. The doctors are taking over where God should have been. You know, they say, get
Well,
rid of...
everybody's so busy, and they don't want, and they really think, I would want to be dead.
Impatient.
They're already kind of biased towards that.
Yeah.
And I'm not. My thing is what would be a good quality of life for you?
Mm-hmm.
And it's wonderful. And to see people, one woman, she was determined to commit suicide, and I talked to her, and I mentioned something she hadn't thought of, and she goes, oh, so she changed her mind.
Yeah.
And she was so happy. She was like someone who just survived a plane crash. But a couple days later, this was at the hospital, 2 of her friends stopped me in the hall, and they go, we're going to get you fired. And I said, what? And they said, you interfered with our friend's right to choose. You talked her out of assisted suicide.
Oh, come on.
And I thought, this is what we've come to?
They don't, oh. Well, listen, my friend, we're at the end of our show.
Well, it's a lot of information,
Yes.
but I don't mean to be depressing.
No?
We really can do things. We have people in nursing homes who never get visitors. And
We need to go see them.
We've started a Good Samaritan program in my church where
Yes.
we saw who in our community had special needs and tried to meet those needs. We need to do positive things. Like I said, we have birthright showers. We should have natural death
Yes.
initiatives.
Way it should be.
And we're working towards it. There's many of us working for it.
Good. More power to you, girlfriend.
Thank you.
Nancy, Valko, thank you so much for coming
Well,
on to
thank
my
you for
show.
having me, Patty.
We love you, and thank you
God
so
bless.
much. See you next week. This is Patty Hunter.
Godspeed, my love, until we meet again. You're always in my heart and every dream. Don't let this time apart give in to all our fears. God will keep us close from up above. So until we meet again, Godspeed, my love. God is with us always and for the rest of our lives.